I appreciate that. Yeah, no, so yeah, we can go live as soon as you're ready. So
Okay.
my question was to you: are you familiar with what agnosticism actually is?
I mean, I think I am, but I could be wrong. I mean, I've called myself an agnostic before, and it was just when I was not certain that there was not a God. Basically, I was pretty open to like the immaterial elements of the world. I knew that there was something besides just like there's an argument that like charity could be or love or like kindness or those kinds of things because they're immaterial that they would have you could compare those to a god stuff, even like people talk about like the spirit of war and of anger and that kind of thing. So
Yeah,
that's
I
what.
think that's a really, yeah, that's a very good. I think a lot of people, that's a general understanding of things. The key difference, though, to what people
Sure.
understand and to what you mentioned there, and I guess I'll just repeat this because we were offline, but I'm getting ready to do a discussion on somebody else's channel about the history of agnosticism and atheism and how those terms have evolved over the millennia. And agnosticism hasn't really changed. I can't find anything anyway when I look back into it, do my research, how agnosticism is any different now than it ever was. Atheism, as you may be aware, has gone through several changes. So the long and short of it is here. So
Yeah.
agnosticism, the key difference is that with agnosticism, it's not only that I don't reject any gods, but I don't have any faith in any gods, like you were saying. But the key element to it is an agnostic doesn't believe that you can know anything about any gods or anything supernatural. So when it comes to atheism, for example, atheism, when it started out back in ancient Greece, was specifically a term that was used to define people who rejected the notion of God. And nowadays
Right.
we refer to those people as a hard atheist. So they actually reject, they say there is no God. But that's atheism covers a whole spectrum of different types of beliefs, just like theism
Sure.
does. So if you're going to have a discussion
Sure.
with an atheist, you can't
Yeah.
accuse them of rejecting God just, off the cuff. You have to really find out what kind of atheist they are. So a soft atheist would be somebody who does not hold any beliefs in gods, but they actually believe it's possible to know if there is a God or not. So that's the difference between soft atheism and agnosticism. The agnostic doesn't think it's even possible to know because, so for where I'm coming from to justify that is, we're talking about a God that lives outside time and space, and we're talking about supernatural elements. So everything is unfalsifiable. And because everything is unfalsifiable and untestable, how can a person actually know that this thing is real? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I mean, not all like theistic beliefs deal with a
No,
God
no, no, they
outside.
don't. No. As soon as a
Right.
theistic belief brings the God into the universe, so like the Christian belief, as soon as you've got God's walking in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and you've got Jesus walking on earth and stuff, that's something that I can wrestle with. But the
Right.
concept of an all powerful, omniscient, all knowing God that exists outside time and space, that creates the universe ex nihilo, that kind of a concept is unfalsifiable. There's nobody can know that if that's true or
Oh
not,
yeah.
frankly.
That's definitely, yeah. I mean, that's a big problem. I work with a lot of like creationists in the Catholic world, and that's a big problem between like your most of your Catholic academics and your Catholic creationists is that they say there's basically no jurisdiction that the natural sciences have over creation, over anything supernatural. And it's right, yeah, because you can't look at it from a natural science standpoint. You can't
Exactly. Yeah,
understand it
you
with
mentioned
natural
that,
knowledge.
and that's something actually that I really was looking forward to talking with you about, because I do
Sure.
a lot of discussions with people online. I'm getting ready to actually have a formal debate. Usually, I don't do actual debates. I prefer to have just polite conversations with people.
Right.
But I've
I'm
been
the
making
same
a
way.
lot of traction. Very good.
I'm like,
Yeah, I've been making a
I'm
lot of.
yeah.
Apparently, I've been making a lot of traction online, and I've got a Christian who is. I don't want to. I hate to use the word challenged me to a debate, but I don't know what else. He's offered to debate me, I guess, in a formal setting. So we're actually going to fire off a debate coming up. But that's really unusual for me. I usually just do discussions with people. I get on to. There's a guy. His name is A's Philosophy. It's a
Hmm.
capital A with an apostrophe S and then philosophy. So A's Philosophy. He's a Christian who has a channel, and he
Okay.
hosts live panels for people to get on. And he and I have had some really good talks. We just had what I'll call an informal debate about evolution the other day. It was fascinating, and I kind of wanted
Nice.
to talk to you because I get a chance to talk to Protestant Christians and some Mormons and Seventh Day Adventists, all different types of denominations, but I don't really interact with a lot of Catholics. And
Yeah.
Catholicism is something that I have a lot of interest in. So I thought when I came across your channel a few weeks ago, whenever I reached out to you, I said, "Oh, this is a very interesting guy, and he seems very polite and intelligent. So
Oh,
maybe
thank
he'd
you.
entertain a
Right, huh?
conversation with me about that." But
Would you
before I
tell?
get into my, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I said, would you tell me when that debate is? Because the one you commented on that I was doing with Tom's takes, is what he calls himself. I'm going to debate him, and it's kind of funny, God willing. It's kind of funny because it's it's so beyond polite because he was Canadian and somebody else was debating him, and I support him and he supports me, and like we're very like friendly with each other. And I just saw that the Christian didn't wasn't going to show up for the debate. Like they were in the middle of arranging it. He just stopped responding for 2 weeks. I said, hey, if you need somebody, I could sub in. I think I'll beat you. So
So is
now
it
I'm
is
gonna
this
do.
actually going to be is this going to be a formal debate between the two of you then?
Yeah, it is. It's going to be a formal debate on Discord, and hopefully I can. I asked them to record it for me because I always have equipment issues, which may happen. If you see my video go off, it's because I'm trying to keep this computer from overheating. But
Oh, okay.
you
Okay.
know
Yeah,
exactly
so
what you should be talking about, so I'm here to answer your question. That's good. That's what
how
Saint.
are you going to do a formal debate on Discord? Because normally a formal debate would be like you have a 15-minute opening statement, I have a 15-minute opening statement, we do a cross examination, and then
Correct.
maybe an open discussion and then a closing statement. So how does that going to work on a Discord?
Well, despite the name, uh, they have some mechanics that make that possible. There's a large Discord server that I got into one day when I was praying a lot too hard, and they have like a stage function. So you have somebody that comes in and moderates it, and they can choose who can talk at which time, and they do, and we agree on a structure beforehand and whatnot. I did debate in high school, so I'm kind of skilled at it. I don't like it mostly because you come in not actually connecting or persuading the person you're talking to. You're entirely performing for a third party, you know. But yeah, so that's how that's going to work.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I actually also did a little bit of formal debate in high school. I would certainly not say that I'm skilled at it per se, because I really didn't do very much of it, but I am familiar with I did enough of it to where I know the format and I engaged in a few. But I agree with
Nice.
you 100% is that debate is not about, really learning the other person's position. Or, I mean, you engage with the other person, as much as you're willing to. I've seen debates where people literally just hammer home their own points, and other than a little bit of cross examination, I've even seen people completely filibuster the cross examination to where they just
Yeah,
aren't sincerely engaging. And of all the
yeah, that's
debates I've
most of what I've
watched,
seen. Actually, it's not
yeah,
particularly high
exactly.
quality on this Discord that I've seen so far. So, and it gives you an advantage when you, like Trent Horn's a decent debater, and you can tell it's because he knows the structure. It gives you an advantage when you kind of not just an advantage of like winning or losing, but also an advantage of just making an entertaining and interesting piece of content because it's structured in order to progress. You're supposed to have an opening statement, but by the time you're done, even though you rehash the opening statement, you've addressed everything that you're dealing
Yeah,
with.
you've built your argument. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah,
It's a skill set, no doubt, and that's one of the
it's
problems I have.
entertainment.
But is that just like you said, and you said it very well, is that it's performative, and I have all the debates I've ever watched. I have never, ever, ever seen the loser, the quote unquote loser, sit back and say, you know what? After thinking about it, I guess you're right, buddy. You really caused me to change my position. That never happens. And so it's just something that people can look back on, and especially with the advent of the internet. And that is one thing that makes this nice is that when you post these videos, people years from now, as long as you keep your channel up, they can come back and look at these types of content and stuff like that. So the people that are hosting debates, that information is always out there. So there is a benefit to it in that regard.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, one of the things, because I also have like a background in marketing and business and stuff like that, and so getting into debates in general. Trent Horn was actually the one who inspired me. I wasn't interested in him or whatnot, but somebody I was following on the creationist side of things was talking about how they were trying to arrange a debate, and so I started watching them. and I got back into it just because it's fun, just like some guys like football, and it he is like I've only seen him do like a handful of debates where he is clearly does not like the person he's dealing with. He's pretty good about being friendly with that person. And so me coming into it, I that's kind of my so one goal is I want to be friendly with people. The other thing I want to do is I actually want to um, look for opportunities if I do change my mind on something to go and tell people. Like like for instance, I was talking to Pierce Watkins, who is an atheist. He told me that, and he was doing street epistemology, and he changed my mind on gay marriage, which I thought was so. I made sure I let him know, and I hope to do that in debate too. Maybe not during the event, but maybe. I mean, because even like debates have so much to do with the resolution and stuff like that that you actually can, if you're smart enough, change your mind. It's hard because you're like fighting, but you can change your mind in the middle of a debate, and doing that can help you win the debate. So I've seen that happen before because a lot of it hinges on semantics and stuff like that. So that's something I hope for, to be honest with you.
Well, I give you a lot of respect for that because, one thing I also would like to clarify just for your audience and anybody else who I try to send traffic to people's channels, whether we end up agreeing or not. I always try and filter traffic to their channel from my sources just because it helps you out
Nice.
and it gets information out there. And the one thing I like to clarify for people from your audience is that, even though I do these discussions and there are views that I hold as an agnostic, I'm actually not out to deconvert anybody from their religion. I find that to be a very unequitable practice personally. I think that religion provides something that's obviously necessary for certain people at least, and I just think it's very disrespectful to try and discredit people's personal experiences. They're on what you might refer to as a testimony, so I just try to avoid that. It's difficult to argue with someone's points without coming across like you're trying to convince them that, they're believing in something that's not tenable, but I try to do the best that I can.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing I've found is just that's why I kind of like street epistemology. I'm taking their class now. Is just if you come in with respect, knowing that this person probably has some very legitimate reasons that I don't know for why they're a Muslim, and then you just make a ton of progress. Like, and I found out it's true. I mean, like atheists, for instance, they have a very accurate understanding of economics. One of the things that I have been very frustrated about with Catholics since converting to Catholicism is they have a terrible understanding of economics. They're just retarded about it. And it's caused my family actually a lot of trouble. But I did I ask you, when is that debate? Can I have the information on it? Because I'd love to watch it.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. So the debate that's coming up, we don't have a date set. We're actually in the middle of right now trying to figure out a date to make that work. I'm hoping to get it set for sometime within the next 2 weeks because I have so many things going on, and I'm really excited because I feel like I've come up with kind of an innovative theory for a naturalistic explanation of morality. And a lot of people, a lot of atheists, the significant majority of people in the atheist and agnostic community do not believe in objective morality. And I believe that I have a theory that proves objective morality is actually one of the natural laws.
Wow. So that's cool.
Yeah. So I'm going to debate the title of the debate is going to be, is natural morality, objective morality, provide a better answer than God's objective morality? So that's kind of how. So he's going to debate for God's objective morality, and I'm going to debate for natural objective morality. But in order to do that, I have to prove that there is a natural explanation for morality that exists, objectively.
Yeah, you're kind of setting yourself up. Yeah, that's a tough one. I'd love to watch that.
It is. I think I've got it nailed. I finally finished all my premises, and I've got it down. I'm really confident that it works, and it doesn't. There's no logical contradictions or anything like that. You know what I mean in the theory itself. So
nice. Well, we could probably get along on that because No, but do tell me, like, where is it going to be? How will I find out about it? You don't want to just let me
It's
know?
yeah, it's going to be on it. So the guy's YouTube channel is going to be hosting it. Is called A's Philosophy,
Oh,
as I
okay.
mentioned before.
That's right. You
It's
did
a
mention it.
capital A with an apostrophe S, capital A apostrophe S, and the word philosophy. And you can check out his channel right now and subscribe. We've done several discussions. We just had an informal debate about evolution. I've had 3 or 4 talks on his channel. Now, I will warn you in advance, about a week ago or so, within
Uh-huh.
this last week, I went onto his channel, and he and we always have very civil discussions. It never gets out of hand. But sometime, here in the last week or so, I was on his channel, and there was like 4 or 5 Christians that came on, and I was the only skeptic. And
Uh-huh.
that was a 3 hour, just, it was a hot mess. I mean, they were being so disrespectful and so rude. I mean, I
Uh-huh.
actually went back and rewatched it a few times to make sure that I was seeing things correctly, and just took down some numbers. And they accused me like 20 some times of saying things that I never said. And I was the only person in the whole 3 hour discussion that ever admitted that I might possibly be wrong, or science might be wrong, or the Bible might be right. Not one of those guys ever admitted that they might actually be wrong about anything they were asserting. So it was a really unusual. Normally it's not that heated. Normally the stuff on his channel is
Sure.
is really, really chill, but that was an
Yeah.
unusual thing. But and,
Well, you can't
I
control that.
understand people.
It's
No, I
understandable.
understand that people get tied to these beliefs, and when you tell them something, just is factually wrong. Like, I try to, because I do believe in science, I try to avoid using words like facts, because science just doesn't work in those terms. We think of things in
Sure.
theories, and even laws we don't consider to be facts, as far as what we would consider to be an immutable fact. So, but I
Right.
do believe, because, so just as my background is, I don't know if you can see my picture here. I'm riding an innovative kayak. It's a hybrid kayak stand-up paddleboard towable that I invented. I've got 2
Okay.
patents for my inventions. It's a whole design that I worked with, and came
Wow.
up with the kayak. And then I'm also licensed by the U.S. Coast Guard to build boats. So I know for a fact, because of my own credentials and expertise, that Noah's Ark was not seaworthy. So that cannot be a literally true story. And I know that for a fact because of what I know about boat building and what
That's
I know about
interesting. Okay.
seaworthiness. But other
Fair enough.
people who I've really looked into that story, and every single field of science has thoroughly debunked the flood myth. Now, I was going to ask you about that, because I
Sure.
actually came across a video. I thought it was on your channel, where there was a geologist who was trying to promote what's called the hydroplate theory. Was
That's
that
right.
on your
Yep.
channel? Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yep.
yeah. Okay,
That
so
was the
I don't
last
know.
thing I did.
I don't want to. Yeah, I don't. I did watch that. It's always interesting to see what the other side is saying, and I don't know. I don't want to offend you
Uh-huh.
by anything that I say, but I'm just curious, because I did do a little bit of research into this, and I wanted to ask you
Sure.
about some of these things. But we don't have to get into the whole Noah's flood thing per se, because I understand from what you told me that you actually have something that you wanted to address about God. You had an argument for God, if I
Right.
understand that correctly.
Um, I mean, I do. In fact, I think it's probably we're probably thinking about on the same wavelength with that because what I've been working on, I didn't want to do that, but when I first got into YouTube, I figured that the most productive place I could go when I first got back into YouTube was just into atheist groups. And so I was there for a long time before they really wanted me to argue that God existed, and I was kind of avoiding that. And so then I ended up building an argument. And my argument for God's existence is that, and the terminology is a challenge, because these things do not mean the same to everybody. Like the difference between morality and ethics or whatever doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. But my argument might be the same thing, that because there is a naturalist morality, that proves God's existence, which is kind of a complex argument. You know what I mean? But what I'm trying to do is get away from the Ten Commandments and getting away from moral law like thou shalt not murder, and I'm actually using the standards of virtue, like justice, prudence, that kind of thing, which are more universal and more subjective. Um, but anyways, I mean, honestly, we don't. There's so many bugs in this room. I don't know what's going on. I wouldn't mind talking about what you're talking about. I'm not an expert in any of those fields, so I'm happy to give you my perspective on it. I'm not empirical. I'm very, some people call me philosophical, but I don't think that's accurate either. My way of thinking is um, is more metaphysical and more like abstract. Um, well, you probably see this over time. Point is, I'm not empirical. That's the point.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we, because I'm happy to entertain, I'm in your house and I'm a guest, so I'm happy to entertain whatever flow of conversation that you prefer. And if you want to talk about, so it's interesting that you're approaching it from a morality standpoint, given the fact that that's literally what I just got done. I just got done typing up my arguments and my opening statements and stuff. So like, it's not fresh on my mind, but I do
See if
want
I
to
can pull
ask
it up.
you just a
Good.
yeah,
No, you
I
ask
do
me
want to just
questions. That'll
ask
be
you,
way easier.
a few questions about Catholicism and specifically your, I don't want to say your method, but your interpretations or how you practice, what you practice, because not
Sure.
everyone is going to approach things the same, obviously. So,
Yeah.
and when it comes to Catholicism, my understanding is, and you please correct me wherever I'm wrong, is that the Catholic Church actually um, accepts evolution as the best scientific theory, and they also so they believe. I guess my assumption is they believe that God created using evolution for creation. The other thing that I understand is that when it comes to the flood narrative, is that the Catholic Church does not take a strong position definitively either way, but what they do is they encourage people to read it allegorically and to not read it literally. So is that the camp that you're in? Because when you're hosting people that talk about the hydroplate theory, you're talking about a very literal interpretation of a global flood. That's certainly not allegorical.
Oh yeah. Um, I do not. Okay, so you'd have to define the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is I think it's the largest religion. Maybe I'm wrong. Or maybe it's the largest Christian denomination. It's a very large organization. Um, and so if I ever say the Catholic Church believes this or the Catholic Church believes that, I'm trying to talk about the magisterium, but I'm really talking about the Church triumphant and the saints and the popes and the Church fathers and all those who have recorded their beliefs very specifically. And those people do not believe in evolution, even a little bit. I mean, there is like a certain amount of adaptation, especially once after the flood, when the ark lands and animals come out and they spread throughout the earth and men spread throughout the earth. There's a certain amount of adaptation, which you'd call maybe microevolution or something like that takes place. But the mechanics would be different. So no, the Catholic Church does not believe that. Now, the majority, they do not believe in evolution, and they do take the flood narrative totally literally, and it's a global flood. But the majority of academic Catholics right now, and probably the majority of clergy, although there's no way to really know, people are pretty avoidant of it. Yeah, they probably accept evolution, or they just don't get into it. And that's something that's kind of occurred in recent history in the Catholic Church. It's also, and I think part of it is because it's not necessarily the best way to evangelize. So it's kind of like a discussion for Catholics to have amongst themselves inside the church, because it's just not. It's not the most immediately important thing when you're dealing with
neither of these are real theological claims per se. It's really more about how you interpret the Bible as opposed to literally or allegorically, or what credence you put in certain narratives.
But when you get down to the theology, so the thing is when you string all these things together, the faith is not coherent without creation, without a literal interpretation of Genesis. Um, and that's basically what the church fathers said and had councils about it is you, if you're going to make an allegorical interpretation, unless the actual scripture is an allegory, like Jesus's parables or something like that, which some of those are not. I mean, some of those are actual circumstances he's talking about. But if you're going to make an allegorical situation, it has to be built on the literal interpretation. The allegory is not these words on the paper. The allegory is God made this happen in reality. He made Noah build a flood in this way to symbolize the church. You know, that's when the allegory. So it's always, it rests on the literal interpretation. But it's very, I mean, it's very deep and significant. And the details that are recorded by the Holy Ghost. Not all details are recorded. You know, so that's my understanding of the Catholic faith, the universal.
That is interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. Okay.
I don't.
Well, I didn't
and one of the reasons I'm on the internet is because I don't think guys like you have access to guys like me, like you said, and so that's why part of what I'm doing is trying to please my Lord Jesus Christ, who right now is punishing everybody gravely, and I'm trying to merit by doing what he wants, and I've exposed myself to a lot of humiliation, a lot of trouble, and I think the reason why you don't run into Catholics that believe in creationism is because they don't like the internet, and they don't like the public, they don't like the agora, you know what I mean, the Athenian marketplace. If that makes sense.
Well, I do understand. I do understand. I can certainly relate to that. You're kind of drawing a target on your back from or almost on your stomach, because it's your in group that's going to give you the most trouble. You know, when you start adopting these more secular views. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't want to.
If you understand marketing, it's all good. I mean, bad press is good press. You know?
So well, that's what they say. Myself. That's what they say. I've owned a couple of businesses, and I'm not too sure I buy that, to be honest with you. But that's what the experts say. Yeah, it certainly would. I would think so. So at any rate, but I didn't come to dash your hopes and dreams about the flood or anything like that. If you want to know problems about the hydroplate theory or problems about Noah's Ark, I'm happy to discuss those things. But I was just really looking more for clarification, because I thought it was interesting based on my own research, just looking into it. And I did not do a deep dive whatsoever. I just did a very surface, cursory look. And the information I got is just that the Catholic Church, this is what I said, that the Catholic Church does support evolution by and large, macro evolution, not just micro. And the flood is not, most of the first chapters of Genesis are not to be taken literally. It's like the first 12 chapters or whatever they say aren't to be taken literally. I can't remember how many exactly. But so I was just curious where your stance was.
What you find when you search for it. I mean, it's unfortunate, but the approach of the Catholic Church since the 1970s has been to obscure our beliefs in order to make them more palatable to people, and the internet and the world is just happy to agree with, to go along with that. And like I said, most clergy and most laymen aren't equipped to argue about it, and they just accept what they're told, and whoever they happen to be. That's why if you're in the Catholic Church and you are a creationist, they associate it with fundamentalism, and they basically are saying the narrative is that this belief comes from fundamentalist Protestants that are converting into the Catholic faith. And fair enough. I don't know. I was never really Protestant, but I was leaning Baptist before I converted. But I was evangelical before that. Believed in evolution. I was atheist before that. And I believed in all kinds of weird things. But that's the narrative. People aren't very static. Go ahead.
No, I agree with you 100%. That's why it's difficult when we start putting labels on people, because at the end of the day, every human being is an individual. Yeah, they're going to have their own. But you do get groupthink. You do get problems with groupthink. And that is actually, I was saying I never really did finish my statement about that. We got off on that thing. But as much as I'm not trying to deconvert anybody, and that is true, the one thing that I am trying to do in these discussions is to try and get people to embrace a more ethical lifestyle. So, I was really I was very pleased to hear you say that I assume that you accept gay marriage now. Or you said you changed
Um,
your view on it,
well,
or
I'm
is that did I
involved.
take that too far?
Yeah, I it would be tied up with my greater like paradigm that you'd have to get into. But I basically think that it's not it's not a fight I'm going to win, uh, and the focus shouldn't be on that. My whole opinion on gays and homosexuals is the traditional opinion, which is I don't think it is an identity. I think it's I think it's just a it's kind of like it's kind of a result of Western philosophy centered around the idea of the self. And whereas, like, if you look into old moral manuals and stuff like this, especially they talk about this in the Eastern Orthodox people I know, sodomy was listed as a sin that anyone could commit. And it's definitely true. One of the problems is nobody understands what sodomy is. Sodomy and homosexuality are not the same thing. Um, Neither is Philadelphia, which would be something that I think a lot of homosexuals are essentially arguing for. Um, but sodomy is, as a sin is committed mostly by heterosexuals. And so one of the problems is that the people who are condemning homosexuals, not only do they put them off into a separate group, and the people who like if you say you don't want to be attracted to men and you're a man and you convert, and then religious people try to help you not do what you don't want to do, then just like they might help you with anything else that you want to change about yourself, um, like a lot of people who become Catholic want to be abstinent, and it's difficult to do that, um, or quit pornography or anything like that. Well, there's this mentality that comes from the philosophy of it where they kind of have you in this separate category, and it's almost like you're your own group, and that's not a great way of looking at it. And what it does is it actually enables the sin of sodomy amongst heterosexuals more, because they'll commit sodomy with their wives and think that they're better than a homosexual man who's not even in a sexual relationship. Well, the homosexual man's not even sinning. He might be spreading error or something like that, but I mean, from a religious perspective, he's probably not even doing that, because most people don't go around talking about sex all the time. But the person who condemns him, if he's committing sodomy with his wife, is now guilty of terrible hypocrisy. You know, so
Yeah, yeah,
so that's something to
yeah.
think about. And
Yeah,
another
no,
thing,
that is interesting. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, the other thing about it is kind of the whole central point of my media work at this point is that I think usury is the sin that nobody likes, that everybody suffers from, that if somebody does like it, it's because they don't understand what it is. And basically, it doesn't matter if somebody's a homosexual or a sodomite or, at this point, I'm tempted to say even a pedophile. Basically, there's nobody that should be thrown into what your average person is forced to deal with because of usury in society right now. You know what I mean? Like this, working as hard as you can for some other person just to survive from day to day and not be like sterilized and put out of the normal stream of life. That's another thing Pierce Watkins said to me. He said, well, transsexuals, do you think they should lose their job? And I said, well, it's, if we call it a mental illness, like a lot of people on my side do, then I don't think somebody with a serious mental illness that increases their suicide rate should suddenly lose their income. That doesn't seem like the best thing. And now they're scraping to survive on top of everything else. Now, maybe if it's a religious, organization that's hiring them or something like that, you figure that out. But, so that's my point, is that usury is so important. And I think it's the unifying evil that everyone has to work together against. Uh, that's why he changed my mind in gay marriage. You know, I don't think I should go out there and advocate against gay marriage anymore. I think I should be very honest about it. But it's so confused. The things I just said about sodomy kind of show that this is a very confused, disorganized subject that people don't even know what they're talking about. You know.
Well, I think this is an important distinction, and I think you're on the right track, because irregardless of what you or I or anybody else believes is quote unquote right or wrong or natural or unnatural, whatever, what's most important is how we treat these people. You know, and that's
Right.
that's the fight that I'm making against religion, that I'm actively making against religions, is when it comes to, you know, I give you, you have every right to think whatever you want to, as far as I'm concerned. You know, that's in your own head, it's in your own life, and you can even talk to it with your own family to a certain degree. That's your right to do. Even your kids, raise them how you feel that, you know, you're a parent, those are your kids, that's your right. But when it comes to how you vote, when it comes to when you're out in public and how you treat your coworkers, or if you're an employer, how you treat your employees or your customers, that's where I have an issue with a lot of what happens, what you see coming from the Christian church. And I'll just give you a perfect example. So I was having a very polite, slightly heated, but very polite debate. It's not a formal debate, but an informal debate with some Christians. So there's a guy who has a Christian apologetics YouTube channel called Reconstruction Zone. And it's kind of a play on words for Justin's atheist deconstruction zone, which is very popular. I don't know if you've ever heard of him or not, but he's a really smart guy. He's got a master's in divinity, and he's now an atheist, and he knows the Bible inside and out. And he has live debates with Christians all day, every day. And he's literally just cooking Christians left and right. He really knows his stuff. And so there's a guy named Mike, who's a Christian apologist, who's set up his own channel called Reconstruction Zone. And so I went on there, and I made a comment about maybe the flood myth or something. I mentioned it, or Exodus myth or something like that. And he came back with, well, these aren't myths, these are historical events. And he made a comment. Oh, that's what it was. He made a comment about how every single thing we find in archaeology is proven by the Bible to be 100% true. And it's always the best explanation for everything we find in archaeology. And I said, well, that's just demonstrably false. I says, there are certainly a lot of things we find in the Bible that does correlate to what we find in archaeology, because it was a book written in a period of time by people who were obviously living at that time. And so certainly they knew who Babylon was, for example. They knew who Persia was, so obviously there are going to be some elements of this that are historically accurate. But what we often find is that the narratives are twisted to a particular agenda. And so when we actually look at the archaeological evidence, we find that there's a better explanation for it, if not a direct contradiction. And I said, there's also scientific errors in the Bible, and there's also internal contradictions in the Bible. So he invited me onto his Discord to have a debate about all this. So it's just me over there with like probably 100 Christians. I don't know how many people are. It's a Christian Discord, so I'm the only skeptic, really. And we were having a very nice debate. I pointed out, so I decided to pick the book of Daniel, and I listed a few bullet points and how the archaeology points to a very clear explanation of certain things, such as we know that Belshazzar was not the son of Nebuchadnezzar. He was the son of Nabonidus. We know that Darius was not a Mede. He was a Persian. We know that Xerxes was not the father of Darius. He was the son of Darius. And we know that Belshazzar was not a king. He was a co-regent. So there's other issues in the book of Daniel. I just want to pick a handful of them to throw out there, that I could support with actual archaeological evidence. So I listed these, and then I listed the actual archaeological evidence, such as the Behustone Stele or the Varen inscription, or different things that talked about where we've got Belshazzar's mother who actually talks about his line and his heritage and stuff. And, the Christians came back with typical apologetics, which is what I've heard them 100 times before. This is not a new discussion I've had with people. I've been having this for 2 decades now. And so I already knew the arguments they were going to make, but unfortunately, the arguments they're making are based on assertions without any archaeological evidence to prove any of these assertions whatsoever. They are possible explanations, but they're not even remotely the most likely explanation, given that we have archaeological evidence that points us in a different direction. So that's really the problem. Becomes when you and their main argument then comes down to, well, the Bible is never wrong, so we should give it more credit than other things, even though the other things are pointing in a different direction, and we actually have the other things. The
Right.
problem with that is that if you're just every time you come to a possible situation where the Bible isn't technically wrong, but it's not really the best explanation, but you go ahead and give it that check mark in the right box in the correct column, and all your check marks go into the correct column because you're giving it what's called special pleading. Then you're going to look at the Bible and say, look, the Bible's never wrong. But it's because you've leaned to the Bible every single time there's a question. You see what I'm saying? And so at that point, you're not really
Sure.
fairly judging, in my opinion, the evidence, the actual evidence. And so it's a false equivalency to say the Bible is never wrong, especially because of the internal contradictions in the Bible. But that's a whole nother discussion. So at any rate, so long story short, we're having this debate. I didn't think they would concede any of the points, but we were being very civil back and forth.
Right.
And then about a week ago or so, he thought it would be a good idea, and I don't know why, because it wasn't something I had brought up, but I'm sure you're aware that the slavery topic is making a lot of traction these days. Biblical slavery.
I've looked about it.
So
I mean, I haven't listened to most of what's been said, but I hear people say it to me.
Yeah, there's quite a bit going on around the internet, atheists, and rightly so, because it does point to a big problem when it comes to the claim of God's objective, quote unquote, objective morality. The slavery issue is a perfect example of how that doesn't make any sense. But I didn't bring up this, so I'm not sure who brought it up, but this guy, Mike, who's a Christian apologist, is so desperate to defend the Bible and the stories in the Bible that he is actually actively justifying slavery by saying there's nothing immoral about owning another human being. And further makes the claim that he actually owns his children as property for their whole lives. Like it's not just until they're 18 or something, which he still doesn't. You're a father, and I'm sure you know that children are not your property, quote unquote. You're their guardian. You know what I mean? They're not property that you can just do whatever you want with, like you can your car. You know what I mean? You got to take care of them. There are laws that govern how you deal with your children, and when they're 18, they have full autonomy to do whatever they want to do.
Sure. Well, sure. Go ahead.
So even if you thought there's a certain level of ownership,
any of these questions, it's hard to hold all of them in my mind. Good.
Yeah. So even if you thought there was a certain amount of ownership, and I would never use that word as a parent myself, but even if a father thought, because you are responsible for them and you do love them and you do provide for them, that you could feel like you might own them. You do control them, obviously, to a large degree. But as soon as they're 18 by law, they're no longer, none of that applies. They can do whatever they want to do legally. They can leave your house. They have their full autonomy. They can make their own decisions, whether they choose to or not. That they have that legal ability. Whereas a slave, the Bible, you own them for life as property, and you can pass them down on as inheritance and such. So it's a completely what we would call a red herring fallacy to try and link your relationship with your children to the relationship of a chattel slave and then say there's nothing immoral about it. And I was so disgusted by this behavior of people trying to defend chattel slavery that I called them I said, dude, you're just being right now. That is absolutely ridiculous, and it's harmful. And then he started making gay slurs to me, which I'm not even gay, not that matters, but that's his, this is his whole mentality. And so this is the kind of behavior that he feels he's justified in engaging in because he's so desperate to defend his belief system. And that's the stuff that I have a problem with. That's the stuff that I'm actively trying to turn, not just me, but many skeptics, atheists and agnostics alike, are trying to get Christians as a group to just step back from the situation and realize that when you're promoting racism, when you're promoting bigotry, when you're promoting sexism, that this is harmful. By and large, this is harmful behavior. So as an individual, there's nothing wrong with, as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing wrong with a person being a Catholic or a Christian or a Muslim or whatever else. The problem is when the Muslim takes the gays up on top of the roofs of buildings and pushes them off to their death because they're gay. That's where I want to step in and say, no, wait a minute, now we're taking things too far. You know what I mean?
It'd probably be, I do know what you mean. I know what you mean. It'd probably be helpful to take one thing and talk about it, because there was a whole list of things there. I think that I could probably find disagreement.
Just in general, it was about the behavior, I'm just trying to finish up what I had started saying, but when I'm not here to deconvert anybody, because I'm not here to deconvert anybody. I'm just here. My only fight against religion is about these things I'm talking about right now, just to clarify that, so I don't care if people want to be
I see what you're
religious.
saying.
I only care about how people treat each other. And that ties into what you were talking about gay marriage, is that you may have your own personal views of whether it's right, wrong, normal, or abnormal, or whatever. But as long as you are focused on treating them well and treating them with respect and respecting their autonomy as adults to do whatever adults want to do, then nobody should criticize you for that, because you have an equal right to believe what you want to believe. So it's got to be a
Right.
two-way street. That's how I was trying to tie all that together.
Yeah, I don't want to go. I will tell you this, if it interests you, I probably, on all those subjects, I probably could just like openly disagree with you. But I think that what you're talking about as far as dialogue between, which is a big word in the Catholic Church, between American Christians and agnostics and atheists, because this is something I've been working on a long time. It's been a big focus. Is I think that there's a problem of miscommunication and of ignorance, all in all, where people just there's not a set definite meaning to all of the words people use. So like slave has way different meanings. Autonomy, is a new word that has a very precise philosophical origin. And there's a lot of different things like that. Like even saying Christian or saying Catholic or saying Muslim, or saying agnostic and atheist, like we opened up talking about, just means like you have to parse out these things in so much detail before you even know what the other person's trying to say. And I think that especially amongst American Christians, because historically they come from the English tradition of not clearly communicating about theological issues in order to avoid killing each other. Because in the English Civil Wars, after England split from the church and then was beset with all these different opinions on religion, people killed each other in such vast numbers. And then rather than going and uniting back into any particular church, what they did was they kind of made the ideas of Christianity so much less specific. And even like King James Bible has this and stuff where like, like if you talk about love and you don't talk about caritas, which is a very specific philosophical thing with reams written about it. But love could be sexual love. It could be, affection. It could be a lot of different things. And it's not the same word. That's the problem. I think American Christians just aren't, by and large, equipped to communicate what they actually mean. And they're trying very hard, and then they get very frustrated if they're dealing with somebody who's a great distance away from them. You know what I mean? Whereas, like, Cortez, when he came and they had Montezuma, they were able to communicate and get along with Montezuma, who spoke a completely different language, and they had respect for him and everything like that, even though he was literally doing human sacrifice. And it was because they had a philosophical understanding and an intellectual development that helped them understand their fellow man in a very like deep way that nowadays is kind of hard to recreate. That's just one example that you might not even be aware of, but I could probably.
Well, I am fully aware of definition and things of this nature. Now, when I'm talking about slavery, for example, and again, I didn't bring this up to these guys. This is something I just jumped into the middle of it there. But when a person attempts to falsely parse out biblical slavery as it's this actually moral thing that was happening, and try to that's completely detached from reality. And if you need actual scholars who have done a lot of work on this and can really explain to you, who are qualified to explain this, because hearing me say it You can say, well, I don't have the qualifications. I build boats. What do I know about slavery? And that would be a
Sure.
fair criticism for you to make. I'm just basing this off of my own, a lot of what I would say, even emotions and stuff. But I'm aligned with the scholars on this. And so I would recommend looking into what Dr. Josh Bowen has done. He's written a book about biblical slavery and how it comports directly to chattel slavery and can be correlated to the slavery that we find with the North Atlantic slave trade. And there is no difference, morally or ethically speaking. And again,
Okay.
this isn't me just making that claim. This is experts who
Sure.
actually study the history, who know about the
Okay.
period, and are not just biblical scholars, but actual historians who actually study what slavery was in the area and what it looked like, and things of this nature, all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi and these other things. So there's definitely literature out there that completely debunks any notion that this was some kind of a moral edict that God put down by saying you could kidnap these people, you could take them as war prisoners, you could kidnap the women, kill everybody else except for the young virgin girls, and that's somehow a morally right thing to do. The only argument that Christians I've ever heard them try to make is, other than crazy people who say their children are their property, is to say that God's morals are objective because God is somehow objective in the whole thing, which is exactly what I'm going to have this debate about. Is that this actually is a logical contradiction, and it does not actually meet any definitions that we use for objective or subjective, because God cannot be objective. God has a mind, and so therefore, by definition, God can't be objective. Anything that God decides or thinks is all part of God's will, and this is all part of how we define the word subjective. So when you start to say that God has a mind but God's objective, then this is what's called a special pleading fallacy. And anytime you have to engage in logical fallacies to defend a position, I would highly recommend that the person looks a little more closely at what they're trying to defend, and maybe if there's a different way they can articulate or understand that position. Because again, if you're going to engage sincerely with people and expect people to accept your position or even be able to understand your position, you've got to be able to use words with definitions that people are actually using themselves. And a great place to start is the Oxford Dictionary. But you can also look at what scholars are actually saying about these things when you get into more of a philosophical approach. So when it comes to slavery, we know exactly what chattel slavery is, and we know exactly what it means to own a piece of property. That is something that every common person can understand. But if you're having a difficult time trying to parse out how one can be moral and one is immoral, one type of slavery, chattel slavery, is moral and one type is immoral, then you'd have to go to the experts and have them really lay out the case for you.
Um, well, I mean, I don't think like the application of the word moral, it is subjective to God, and it is also relative to God and to the circumstances. Like I'll give you an example of what I think a morals are, related to actions that people make. It's not like if I say, so you could talk about the action of writing down these laws about slavery or any of the actions that these laws deal with. You know what I mean? And so that's why I say it gets more complicated. So I'll give you an example of a moral situation where somebody enslaved a person, and I think it was probably the morally correct decision. It might have been complex, but it's, they're in the ballpark of what the best thing to do was. And I think it's Columbus coming to Cuba and the Caribbean, because when he came to the Caribbean, he found all these, maybe I don't know, maybe you know more about this than me, but this is my understanding currently, is he came and he found all these tribes, and the Caribs were cannibalizing these other tribes and owned little boys, would castrate them, raise them up, slaughter them, and eat them. And so here are these people that have lived that way. That's the society they grew up in. That's the moral framework that they're given. And so he allies with some of these tribes, he defeats the Caribs, and he's not killed every one of them in battle. There are women and children. And so he enslaves them and sends them back. And there's all kinds of different circumstances, not just him doing it and all those kinds of things that are worth considering. But generically looking at the situation, he basically enslaves these people, sends them back to Spain so that they can have a different society to grow up in that doesn't do that. Because that action of like keeping people for cattle to be eaten in this way that is much worse than American slavery of the Irish and of blacks, which was done very immorally, but not necessarily by the people who owned the slaves in the end.
Well, let me before you go
Okay.
too far, let's just address one at a time here. So, by your scenario that you just created, and this is a historical thing you're talking about, which I am somewhat aware of. I don't know all the details, so I might be missing something. But here's the problem: I have no issue with killing these men of fighting age that are eating people. I've got no problem with that whatsoever. As far as I'm concerned, I would still consider that to be immoral, but it is the lesser of two evils. So when I'm talking about natural laws of morality, then what you're looking to do is reduce harm. But sometimes you have to, two decisions you have to make, and we have to pick which one is going to be less harmful. So obviously killing people that are eating other people, that is certainly the less harmful thing to do, as terrible as killing people is. The stretch that you're making that I cannot agree with, though, is that you're making the stretch where we've killed the men of fighting age, but we're going to go ahead and enslave the women and children. Why not just let them live? Let them live and fight and defend themselves.
Well, that's where it helps to understand the circumstances. So, I mentioned he's allying with the local tribes. Okay, people know about this from the Aztecs, like when you watch that movie Apocalypto and whatnot. Well, the Caribs were terrorizing all the other tribes. Okay, well, here are these other tribes that also are in this circumstance where they're not the ones who own these cattle, men, these people, these human beings, but they're the ones who are like being taxed for their children and stuff like that, and have to give up their children to this terrible situation. Well, now they've conquered their tyrants, and they have full access to their tyrants' wives and daughters and sons. And this is what's been happening for hundreds of years. So part of the reason, there's a few different reasons, and you see this in a lot of like, the capturing of war slaves and stuff like that. Well, I mean, women, widows, and orphans, the Bible says provide for them. Well, if their father and husband has died in a war, and you're not necessarily the one that killed them, but like another person in your nation who you don't even know killed them in battle, or maybe you did kill them, but it was battle, it was a thing you were in, surviving. Well, those women and children need to be provided for. And so that's part of the reason. But then in this really extreme situation with these Caribs and then the Aztecs, very similar, you want to get those innocent people out and back to Spain, away from these new people who you're just interacting with, who are probably going to want to take some vengeance, and I'm not saying, the thing is that's the problem with morals, is they're full of exceptions. It's like, as soon as you introduce all of the things, because I'm a novelist, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if you ever read like Cormac McCarthy's The Road or something like that. It's like a novelist's occupation is really to lay out, from a morals perspective as a Christian, is to lay out for men very complex moral situations that they're probably never going to run into, so that they can imagine them, so that if they do run into them, they might have some equipment, like the Stoics taught about doing. And so in the world, there's been all these sorts of situations, you know what I mean? And that's when the objective morality, like thou shalt not murder, has never been, or thou shalt not kill, has never been clear and straightforward to anybody. You know what I mean? It's always had to be explained. Well, you can kill in this case. You can kill in that case. You know, we don't mean don't kill animals. You know what I mean? And the same with pretty much all, I mean, even the first commandment, you should have the Lord thy God and our God. Well, who is God? You know, he's the one that shall not be named. You know, it's like we don't have an image of him. We're not allowed to have an image of him. Well, then, you know, the whole Bible is full of examples, and all of Christian history is full of examples. Catholics are constantly accused by Protestants of making images or confusing God with other things. And that's basically what people do anyway. So,
Yeah, it's
I don't know.
interesting, and
Does that
I
answer your
agree.
question?
To, well, no, not frankly. It
Okay.
doesn't. I mean, it's an answer. It's an answer. I don't think it's the correct answer, because what you've done here is that you've drawn a lot of assumptions. You've drawn on a lot of assumptions that these people's lives would be so much worse in a particular situation, and therefore it's best if we own them as property. And you said the key phrase there
Well,
that I think you kind of, well, hold on, let me just, if I may, I
okay.
think one of the key phrases that you said there is, okay, so you've killed all these men, right? Which I'm not. First of all, I think there's other solutions, that could have been possibly explored before just killing these people, because we could have maybe tried to educate them for one thing, imprison them for another thing. You don't have to actually just go kill them, but let's just say you have to kill them. Well, you've got these women and children that you said yourself, well, you could take them into your home. And there is a significant difference between taking a mother and a child into your home and making them a slave. So you're drawing a false equivalency here. And then to try and map that onto chattel slavery, which is a completely different thing altogether, is just two false equivalencies that you've made to try and tie that into a nice bow. So I'm not sure if that analogy is really the best analogy to try and say, well,
No, I
look,
mean,
it's okay
no,
to kill people.
that's the problem is I'm not trying to justify, I'm not trying to argue against what you've presented. I'm just trying to say it's much more complicated than people give it. And it's like you're kind of assuming, no, I'm not mapping that onto chattel slavery. I'm mapping it onto, well, there are circumstances that come about that people, okay, so we'll just add more details and more circumstances. Well, how do you convince somebody to, first of all, we could talk about the fact that, historically, and it's written in the Bible when it says Jesus Christ came in the form of a slave. Well, who was he a slave to? That's always been traditionally interpreted as he was a slave to Saint Joseph and the Blessed Mother. And they actually talk about him in the womb being a slave. So, like, that's why I say, well, we can talk about the definition of slavery and the fact that people had a completely different understanding of slavery before the modern times, where they did think about their children as property, and they said, well, these are my property, but they have an intellectual soul. They're free before God. They'll have to answer before God, but I'm responsible for them. Like I'm responsible for a dog, or I'm responsible for my car. I have to follow the laws that dictate, and I also have to use my own morality like people currently do in relation to a dog, where they don't beat it to death, things like that. And that's how people had that way of thinking, because the word slave didn't have the same meaning. And then what people were on a guard against was what was the evil that could be done in that circumstance. So, like, you can, because of this control you have over a person, treat them totally immorally, and so that's something people were talked about. It's like, well, you got to treat your slaves well, and this is how, and make sure they can have freedom in this particular way, and that they're not just locked into this situation. And by the way, today, right now, I personally think we live under a form of slavery that's worse than chattel slavery. I personally think that. And so, and that's something philosophers have talked about. Call it wage slavery. I mean, it's like been the big battle for like 125 years at least, if not since the French Revolution, and so it's just, that's all I'm trying to say is, before we talk about, is the rules that God set out in this circumstance in history, are they moral? So before we make a moral judgment about the the ultimate author of this law, who operated through a human author, you know, well, we're going to have to understand the circumstances. First of all, a lot of that had to do with the Philistines and or the Canaanites and the sins that they were committing, and at least and I don't know, people probably say that this is like propaganda against them or something like that, but traditional interpretation and whatnot, it's written in the Bible that the sins that they were committing and things were equivalent to what I described with the Caribs. So it was the same sort of circumstance you're dealing with. Now the difference is, and it's kind of goes to what you were saying, is the Israelites were coming in, conquering, and there were situations God said, kill even the children. And I couldn't really offer you a moral explanation for that. I don't think I should try to, but they were actually settling that land with their women and children. The Columbus and his men were not colonizing on the first few visits when they were attacked by these tribes. And so they couldn't take these women and children into their home because they didn't have a home. So that's why they sent them back to Spain and made them profitable to encourage somebody else to take care of them, because they couldn't. They had to continue their work. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's just why. Yeah, it does, which is why I specifically reference this as the chattel slavery that's described in the Bible. So the chattel slavery is what I'm talking about, you know, and that's the kind of slavery that's been well defined. And even though they didn't even have a word chattel, that I doubt, you know, they had that term, and that, like they're saying, slavery may have meant something differently. What the experts in this field have done is shown the behaviors, because the behaviors haven't changed. So we've given it a different word, but the behaviors themselves, which are laid out. So in the Old Testament, for example, when they talk about slavery, you could beat your slave to death as long as he wasn't an Israelite. You could beat him to death as long as he didn't die within a couple of days. If he died within the first day or two, then you'd get in trouble. But if he died 3 days later, then there was no penalty, because they could say, well, maybe God decided to take his life. You know, I mean, we don't know why exactly, but there was no penalty. We know that it says that you can beat your slave, and as long as he gets up and walks in a day or two, then you're fine. If he happens to collapse and succumb to his injuries after that, which is perfectly reasonable to think that this could happen. You know, I know people who they get in terrible car accidents, take severe beatings in their body, and they live, you know, for a day, 2 days, a week, and then they end up dying. This happens. This is fairly regular occurrence. So this is not just like some kind of random crackpot theory. So you could even if you could beat your slave and he doesn't die. I mean, this is chattel slavery by behavior, not because they had a definition for it. I've heard some people say, for example, that they didn't have a concept of homosexuality, right, in the ancient world. And so there really were no prohibitions against being gay or lesbian, because they didn't understand it in those terms like we do today. And they didn't understand terms of identity. But the behavior was happening, and they were condemning the behavior. They just did not refer to it as homosexuality. It would now, it depends on what culture you're talking about, because it was very prevalent, like in Greece, you know, what homosexuality was. But there are other cultures, like in Israel, that was, the Hebrews were condemning this. And this was the common thing, from my understanding. I'm not a historian, so I might be wrong about this, but my understanding is that homosexuality was largely condemned as some kind of an abomination against the natural order of things, you know, with the exception of some cultures like Greece. So even though they didn't have a word homosexuality, and they didn't have a word gay, and they didn't understand gay culture or whatever, it doesn't mean that the behavior wasn't being engaged in. It doesn't mean it was or wasn't being condemned or condoned. Same thing with the slavery issue. The chattel slavery, and again, this is what the experts are saying on this. This I have read up on, is this is the same exact type of slavery that maps onto chattel slavery from the North Atlantic slave trade, except that it was worse because you could actually beat them to death. And the penalties were a lot looser. There were, and also the North Atlantic slave trade, the significant majority of the African Americans were purchased. They were captured and kidnapped by other Africans in Africa, but they were purchased by white settlers, you know, whereas the Israelites were actually conquering what they called, quote unquote, foreign lands, and they were conquering the land that they believed was the promised land. And they were a warring nation coming in and killing people and displacing them, and then on top of that, enslaving them. So this is a completely unethical and immoral, the behavior as far as I'm concerned. I think as far as most people would be concerned these days. So I don't think that, and I don't think you're trying to do it. I think you're just trying to open people's minds to understanding that there are nuances, and I appreciate that because I agree with you. But there's a
Yeah, well,
specific wording that I'm using for it.
yeah, I mean, the nuances would be what I just described with the Caribs and the sort of behaviors that they were committing would be what you would look at as far as like Canaan. There was cannibalism. There was, I mean, and it's recorded in the Bible, like sacrificing babies and Moloch and stuff like that, and eating their own children. That it was like a religious thing. And I call myself an historian. History is a broad subject. I'm not like deeply, I've read a lot. I know history pretty well. That's actually my basis for religious belief, honestly. But I could tell you're really concerned about this law dealing with beating a slave to death. Probably the right thing for me to do to answer your thing about that, especially since it sounds like a lot of people are concerned about that and they don't get a satisfactory answer, is I would want to see like what it actually says. I'd want to actually go get my Bible, look at that specific thing, and consider it with you. That's what I'd like to do. I know what other Catholic apologists would say, but I don't really agree with their explanations either.
Well, and I think, you're welcome to, you're welcome to do that. I don't think, we don't need to, I'm not trying to hammer on slavery whatsoever or morality, frankly. I just kind of came up in the conversation,
okay.
But we could talk about a number of other things such as killing children, which is clearly commanded in the Bible, the Amalekites, and when God tells them to go kill all their children, except for actually, no, he says kill all the children in that one. I don't think that's the story where he says you could keep the young virgin girls. I think that's a separate issue altogether. So,
yeah, he did
but we know
that.
the Amalekites. Yeah, he does. So it's not just slavery. If we want to really get into the nuts and bolts of ethics and morality, as far as I'm concerned, if a person is going to take the flood narrative literally, God is whacking babies left and right in the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody's got a head count like that guy.
Yeah, God is the author of, he has a permissive will and he has an active will, but when he commands it, that's his active will. He spoke vocally and commanded it. I don't know. There's like very few circumstances recorded. The thing is like the Bible is not used properly. When you use it as like the basis for your understanding of your whole religion, you're going to end up with a lot of confusion. Most of which is what you have, most of what is recorded, and it makes sense that people pick out on, especially when they're outside of the church and they're like, well, you say that this is what your religion is. My religion is the Bible. My friends say Jesus Christ is the Bible because John said the Word made flesh. And so we worship the Bible. Literally, they believe that. And so I got distracted by the chat. And so then, of course, an agnostic outside of the church would then read the Bible trying to understand what these people believe, come across these insane, very extreme circumstances and say, wait, so this is your rule for how to approach the world? This is crazy. And then the Protestants are not far off by saying, well, a lot of them just say, well, we basically follow the New Testament. That's what we have for our life. We're not conquering territory right now.
The new covenant. Yeah.
And I don't agree with that explanation. No, the truth is that these are extreme situations that are given, and it shows that, yes, God can command the death of children in war actively, and that is morally justifiable under my religion. That's true. Now, it's not, there's what that means then. So the way I actually approach the Bible, the way it's meant to be approached when you're Catholic is you read that, you consider it, and then you meditate and you realize what implications that has um, on the meaning of life and on people. And basically, it means that God, who gave these children life, can take it away, and that there are situations where children can live in a society that is so bad that that it would be preferable for them to be killed. That is true, and it's not hard for us to accept.
Can I ask you? Can I ask you a question about that? I'm really Nathan. Is it okay? Do I call you Nathan or Nathaniel? What do you prefer?
I prefer Nathaniel because it's a saint. Saint Nathaniel Bartholomew was skinned alive in Armenia.
That's a lovely story. Okay,
and crucified. Glorious.
Okay, so Nathaniel, I'm not trying to hammer you down or embarrass you or to cause you to, have to defend something that's, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, indefensible. So we can talk about other things anytime you're ready. So I just want to be clear about that. But as long as we're going down this road, I'd like to continue to engage.
Yeah, it's just something we wouldn't be able to agree in without like the same framework and understanding.
Yeah, we're not going to. No, we're definitely going to come to an agreement. But
I shouldn't try to obscure it either. Like that implication is obvious, and you're right to be critical of it. You're right.
And I appreciate you recognizing that because I think that you recognize that I'm not trying to ultimately attack you or other believers. I'm really attacking the idea, the definitions that we're using and the ideas that we're talking about more so than the religions itself, because
I think
that is what it is. But what I'd like to ask you is when we talk about these definitions, so you used the word moral. You said that God is actually being moral and morally correct when he kills babies. And you also said that, what was the other fallacy? Because, now I let it go too long before I said it. So there was a second thing that you said here after that in both situations, if I asked you if anyone on earth did this, would you use that same terminology? And I guarantee that you would not. I mean, I know for a fact, even though I just met you and I've watched a few of your videos, you seem like a very solid dude, and you really do seem like a genuine human being and a family man. And I don't think you're a bad guy. So I don't think that there's any world that exists where Nathaniel is going to say, yeah, it's morally good for people to kill babies in any circumstance whatsoever. That was the other thing. So the other thing you said is that God brought the babies into the world, so therefore it's okay for God to take the babies out of the world. And again, I don't think you would ever say that it's okay because a mother brings a baby into the world that she has the right to kill that baby under any circumstances. I don't even know how you feel about abortion, but certainly not a baby that's alive. Mm-hmm. And so what happens here, what you're doing is you're committing what's called a special pleading fallacy. And this is what I'm going to be addressing in the debate. So you're saying it's rules for thee, but not for me. Correct. So if I tell my children, right, that, hey, you can't punch people in the nose, okay? And then I walk outside and I go punch my neighbor in the nose. And then I come in and tell my children, well, I didn't mean those rules to apply for myself. I only meant them to apply for you because I brought you into the world and I control you and I set the rules of the house. This is my household and I make the rules. Do you see the problem there? The disconnect from how we engage in real life to the apologetics that we engage in when we start talking about things that we believe?
Well, I mean, I regularly have to explain to my children why I can do things that they cannot do. And I think most parents do because they have a special place of authority and of ownership and of responsibility.
Sure, but you don't have the right to go punch your neighbor in the nose for no reason. So just because you can drive a car and your kids can't drive a car, and just because you can eat as much ice cream as you want, your kids can only get one scoop, that's not what I'm talking about here. That's a false equivalency. I'm talking about something that you know for a fact is wrong, and you say, well, I'm only going to say it's wrong for my kids, but I'm going to engage in that behavior.
Yeah, no, but it's not always wrong to punch my neighbor in the nose. The difference is...
we're not talking about self-defense. We're talking about just aggressively going out and just punching him in the nose. Instead of trying to paint it in a situation where you think you can justify it, just accept the analogy for what it is, which is I'm painting a picture where you just go out and randomly punch some guy in the face for no reason whatsoever. Because I take martial arts, I actually teach self-defense, and we don't teach people how to fight. We teach people how to defend themselves, okay? Because we're not pacifists. If some guy wants to hurt me or rob me or hurt my family or something like that, then I'm going to do every single thing I can to make sure that doesn't happen. And the law is on my side. So I am morally justified. Every punch I throw in self-defense is a legal and lawful punch. Even though me and the other guy are both throwing punches, we're exchanging blows, but I'm the only one who's justified because I'm defending myself or my family, right? This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about just going out and just punching somebody in the face for no good reason. You would tell your kids to never do that, I'm sure, because you seem like a good father and you seem like a good human being. So I don't think you're going to go out and do that. But the analogy is God is saying, don't murder, don't kill babies, but I'm going to go ahead and kill the babies and I'm going to murder. And this is what we call hypocrisy. And this is what we call a special pleading fallacy.
I'm trying to operate within your constraints. If I take it from the point of view of a child, and a child's father says, don't hit people for no reason, and then the father goes out and hits somebody, the child, if they're operating, with perfect reason, would say, he must have a reason for that I cannot understand. And so that's a pretty obvious case to make for God. And then the other obvious case to make is he is a very special case. He deserves special pleading. There's nobody else who has that relationship.
But that's according to your narrative. So I would disagree that I don't think anyone deserves special pleading. No, I don't believe in God.
Well, without my narrative, yeah, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, if God is not the one who said kill those babies, then it would be unjustifiable. But if he is, and if the Christian narrative is true, then it is justifiable.
Which is the special pleading. And I appreciate that you admitted that it is
you can't accept. Yeah. That's the problem with the scripture and sola scriptura is you can't. It's also the problem with Catholic evolutionists. You can't have the religion and you can't separate the religion from the scripture. You either have the proper religion and then the scripture works. If you don't have the proper religion, then nobody would expect it to work. Nobody goes out and tries to convince people to convert to any kind of Christianity by talking about the book of Joshua. Nobody.
That's hilarious. That's a great analogy. So there is actually a Christian group that I like to attend their church services every now and again. Because I love to study theology, and there's a lot of nice people that are involved.
That'd be interesting.
So there's a group that I will attend every now and again. And have you heard of something called progressive Christianity? Are you familiar with this term?
I've heard of progressive, and I've heard of Christianity.
Yeah, so you basically can have
as a company. I think they're not as cheap as they pretend to be.
Yeah, no, I'm an independent centrist, so I have a hard time with people on the right and the left, frankly. So I'm not going to try and defend either side. But but as far as these people go, so this progressive Christianity, they accept evolution. They accept the fact that a lot of these Old Testament stories in particular are allegorical. They accept the fact that there are contradictions in the Bible. They don't try and make apologetic excuses for this kind of stuff. But they are still Christians. They love Jesus. They worship Jesus. They sing their songs. They pray. All these things that religious people do, but they don't engage in the same type of literalist type of orthodox behaviors that other well-established like Catholic churches or Protestant churches or Baptists or something like that will engage in. So there are people who do embrace what they feel, whatever sticks out to them or whatever is meaningful to them within their religion, and they discard the stuff that doesn't make sense to them. So it's not to say that it can't be done.
It doesn't have much longevity. It's been my experience. There's a lot of people that do things for a period of time, and I mean, generally speaking, there's enough of I remember I followed a guy who was a Christian, and I really had a hard time understanding a lot of his behavior because it was so immoral. And then somebody pointed out to me that, because he makes a living off of YouTube, right? Or I think it's a different platform now. He said, well, he has a new audience every year. So like people come, uh, and they take what they get from him, and then after a year, they figure out that he's not fully coherent, and then they move on. Well, his income's stable, but the people are coming and going through this cycle, and I think a lot of your smaller sects are like that. I think because the thing is, there's more things to do than just read the Bible, pray, do religious activities, and this kind of comes back to the economic situation. I think that if people had more time to talk and study and things like that, um, then there would be more consistency in everyone's beliefs. But everyone has to work so hard just to live, and so most people don't have time. Even if they read the Bible, they read it in a rushed manner without thinking about it, and they can't hold the whole book in their mind and use it to understand this one passage that they're reading, which is kind of what you have to do if that's all you have. You know what I mean? Now, I'd love to talk to somebody like that. I'd be very interested in talking to them. And I don't have any contempt for that. I think that's probably a very legitimate and reasonable response. The thing is like when you become Christian, it does not take that long. I think 5 years is kind of the maximum before you realize that there are some major, major hypocrisies, inconsistencies, and contradictions between what you see in the world, in any part of it, if it's other people in the church, people outside the church, what you have to do on a daily basis, a TV, anything you run into. There's so much difference between that and then what you accepted when you became Christian. When you
I agree with you 100% because you're talking about the human factor for one thing, and everybody's an individual, like we talked about at the beginning of this, and so that all maps out. That's perfectly understandable why that happens. And I personally, as a skeptic who's on the outside looking in at this, to me that makes sense because, again, I think that when it comes to the Bible itself, you get so many internal conflicts that are found within the Bible that this is where apologetics comes into play. And this apologetics has been this is not a new phenomenon whatsoever. It goes back to the earliest church fathers, trying to figure out how these things don't really make sense. Are we under the law? Are we not under the law? All these different elements of what's going on.
Sure.
The Old Testament, when the law is given to Moses, it's clearly expressed that this law is forever. And so Jesus himself states that the law is forever. Then you start getting into Paul, who actually says that the law is no longer in effect. And so you get this contradictory theology that has to be kind of explained away. And so you also end up getting, because you have so many different things you can pick and choose out of the Bible, you get Trinitarians and you'll get Unitarians. You get 40,000. I don't know if the number is actually 40,000 plus sects of Christianity. That's the number that goes around. And I've never heard a Christian refute that number. I've certainly never counted 40,000 different denominations or whatever, but there's a lot of them.
Yeah, Catholics also say that, but I have heard that refuted as like it's a very inflated number. But Catholics like to
that seems like a pretty untenable. That seems like a pretty untenable number to me as well. But even if it's not 40,000.
Well, the point is that kind of helps the Catholic case because you have an extremely consistent, long-lived organization here that all those denominations broke off of, or arguably broke off of.
Yeah, that was actually one of the questions that I had for you about Catholicism. I had a friend who was a Catholic, and he told me that basically, and I hope I'm not trying to be disrespectful when I say this, I don't know how else to word it, that the people aren't really they're discouraged from making their own interpretation or coming to their own understanding. The church basically tells you how to interpret the Bible. They have the ultimate authority over the interpretation of the Bible. Is this what's going on?
I mean, yeah, but sure, yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about that.
So if that is the case, then it makes sense that they have been less diversified, because that's, if you're going to be a Catholic, you're going to adhere to this policy.
Well, so that's unfortunate. That's unfortunately not true. But I mean, the Bible is a big, complex book, And the amount of things that the Catholic Church commands you to interpret a certain way is not that many, all in all. It's definitely more than any other I can think of, so perhaps like Eastern Orthodox, but there's more than one of those, and that's not really the right term for them. But Apostolic Church would probably be more accurate. But what I was going to say is it's basically. Oh, and then the other thing is, so they command things that you have to believe. Like, for instance, there's plenty of situations in the magisterium where they talk about the fact that Adam, popes, councils, and there are organizations that will tell you all about this, that Adam was made immediately by God out of mud, not out of an ape, for a lot of different reasons. And so the Catholic Church commands you to believe that. Most people are not aware of it. And so the thing is, even though the Catholic Church commands you to believe things, if you're ignorant of them, it's not like if somebody could even hear me saying that they're Catholic, they've been told that they don't have to believe that, and there's no reason why they should believe me because I'm not the magisterium. So like the amount of proof that would have to come at them before they would really be in their own conscience bound to believe this thing, to the point where it's like, well, if you don't believe it, you are now like seriously in danger of losing your soul. There's a lot of other things that would have to happen before that happened, but it happens regularly. I mean, that's the virtue of faith. The virtue of faith is not what Martin Luther, which is I think part of the problem, but I don't want to get off on it. But virtue of faith is believing everything the church teaches, and it has different levels for how you have to believe it. Like the Trinity, you have to believe that. You can't disagree with that. So what faith does is it corresponds all these things together, so that as soon as you convert, if you have the virtue of faith, you believe these things even before you're told them. As soon as you find out the church taught it, there's not any resistance in your will, not any serious resistance. There might be temptation. But that's the thing. It's like we're operating from way different paradigms, and so it's hard to like bridge the gap. Because Catholics understand what I'm talking about, but you probably sounds a lot different to your ears.
Well, I'm just trying to learn from you, frankly. I'm not trying to educate you on the situation. I'm actually here to learn from you about what Catholic faith really is about, and I appreciate you taking the time to explain these things to me because I find all these things fascinating.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to give you a misimpression. Yeah, I don't want to scandalize you. I want you to know.
Can I ask you a question?
And you know what? And you ask me any questions anytime. You're a sincere man. I showed up. I didn't know if I had plenty of people talk to me late at night suddenly, and like it was a prank or something like that. You can ask me any questions anytime, any way you can get a hold of me.
I appreciate you very much, brother. I appreciate you for that. So let me ask you. So you don't believe in evolution, and you believe that things like the flood happened, and I'm assuming you believe the Exodus narrative happened as well.
I've actually looked into that one archaeologically. I haven't actually dug up the thing, but I've read books that assess the archaeological arguments. And
I'd be interested in having that discussion at some time, because my problem with the Exodus narrative, there's two issues with it. One issue is the lack of evidence for what we would expect to find, but you cannot argue from the absence of evidence. That's actually a fallacy as well. So I'm not going to try and do that. But what I would argue against would be from the scientific standpoint is when we start looking at the 10 plagues. And not just because miracles can happen, but the actual problems with infection and disease and crashing their economy and all the different things that would have actually happened had those 10 plagues been a real thing. But that's a different topic for another time.
You mean the historical consequences and whatnot? Because I thought about that a lot.
The actual practical. Yeah, the practical reality of what would happen if the Nile turned into blood, or all the livestock died. And I mean, The fact
What
that they
I
killed the livestock twice doesn't even make sense. But let's just, look past that for a second. But all the amount of disease, the locusts, what were they going to eat? Were the people going to eat after the locusts came through and ate all the plants? I mean, there would be no Egypt if that was a true story. You can't have 3 million people, a third of their population or more, probably close to half the population, really evacuate overnight and not crash the economy just right there alone, even if they were slaves. I mean, there's just so many logistical problems with it. But
my
that's not what I was
my
going to ask. What I was going to ask is,
briefly, we don't have to delve
yeah,
into it, but I do get a little concerned because you are on my channel and you are like making a lot of claims, and so I have a certain obligation to like push back on some of them so that people know I'm not just like agreeing with these things that might scandalize them. Um, so I want to say that for everything else you said, because I also don't want to offend you. I'm just trying to think about everybody. Because
no, that's perfectly reasonable. I
well,
respect that.
my understanding, I do know more about this. My understanding with the Exodus and the conquest and all, and the sojourn and all that, is that the archaeological evidence is there, and it's off by like 200 years. And the reason for the timeline is because of they had an assumption going in. They assumed that one particular king was at this particular time, and then when they came in and they found evidence of these things at a different time, they said, well, we know this king was this time. So they stuck with that assumption and just used that to discount the evidence. But then it's like a very simple error to go in and say, well, that's not the same king. And then
So when you
that was my reading of it, and
well,
that was the case the archaeologists made about it.
you're making very vague claims to evidence. So I'm curious as to what
Sure.
evidence you're talking about. Because if you're talking about evidence of a Semitic people, a large group of Semitic people living in Egypt, that's not the question. That's not a problem because we know about the Hyksos were a Semitic people who actually ruled Egypt for 200 years. So if you're pushing back to the 200-year timeline that you're talking about for Semitic people living there, well, we actually know who they were and why they were there. They certainly were not slaves.
The Hyksos actually were I was going to say that because I remember I looked at, yeah, these are vague things. I can give you a book that you can look into, but since you did that might be appropriate. Sometimes I'm worried that that's like a kind of like an arrogant way to handle things. But if I do it, I'm not saying you did that. But the Hyksos were the consequence. So like Egypt was so weak, and the Hyksos came in and took over, which is what you would expect, because it was a rich piece of territory that was predictably going to recover at some point. But the book was, I'll give you, so there's a book that compiles all this, that has all the footnotes and stuff like that. And I cannot remember exactly what they reference. I watched a movie.
Well, I'm well aware of the Hyksos. I'm well aware of the story of the Hyksos. I've actually studied that. So is that what you're equivocating? The evidence you're talking about for the Exodus narrative of these slaves, these Hebrew slaves, is actually the Hyksos?
No, that's not. The book would be the Genesis documents, and I could probably, by Michael Gladio, so wonderful book. I could probably get some excerpts of that book. I gave it away a long time ago and asked a man to research it for me for this kind of situation, actually. So I could probably just contact him because he's an academic, and I could get some excerpts of that and show him to you if that would help. Like I said, I'm not empirical. I've never been good at footnoting. I'm not ashamed to admit that. That's not my field of expertise. Actually, I don't know if there's a technical problem. There might be. My screen freeze? No, it's fine. I actually think that having been in the publishing world in fiction and in nonfiction, I find that the process of using academic sources and scholarly sources ends up directing you into a very particular narrative that really can't be shook up very well unless you go back to primary evidence, which is something that almost nobody is capable of doing. And so I basically reach my conclusions through logical coherence and the things I understand about the world, I use to judge the new information that comes in, which is how most
That was
people.
gonna, yeah, that was gonna be another thing I was gonna touch on too. Is
Sure.
so I didn't really mean to even get into the Exodus thing, but did you can you link the book that you're talking about, this Genesis narrative or whatever you called it? Is that actually the one that has this evidence? Can you actually link any of these sites or anything that talks about the specific evidence that you're talking about? Because I would be very interested in looking into that. And you could
Yeah,
link it into the chat. You could link it right directly into the chat so that I can refer to this video later if you're able to do that.
well, what I was gonna say, if you want more, he just basically comments and footnotes and all that stuff. Want the actual like sources to look into, which I did look when I was reading the book. I went to those sources and read the excerpts and stuff
Yeah,
like
I
that.
always go to the direct sources whenever I can, because
Yeah,
that's
so I
that's
could.
the only way you're gonna.
Yeah, that's the way I do it. So I would yeah, I'd be happy to get those. Would be harder. I have to go and read that book, find the
Take
footnotes.
your time. I'm just saying, I will legitimately look into your sources if you'll take the time to post them. I'll come back to this video and check it out because I'm legitimately sincerely interested. You know, I have no problem looking at any information that you have if you feel it's
Yeah.
legitimate. The thing I was going to ask is, so do you believe the Earth is only 6,000 years old, or roughly, I should say, 6,000 years old? Or if you don't believe in evolution, do you believe that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old
No, yeah, I believe in a young Earth.
and a younger? So what is
Six
your
to seven.
stance then on, just curious? So when all of science points to a certain direction or makes a certain claim, like every field of science, essentially, what is your position about that? Why would they be doing that?
Because of economic motives, because of the way it's not, you know, you ever looked into like the philosophical underpinnings of the scientific method and what distinguishes it, and kind of, because I'd rather, I mean, I could tell you all about that, and then I could explain to you why that makes it an extremely flawed approach to understanding the world, and then go from there to explain why or how exactly it is manipulated this day and age, you know, because it was different in the beginning when they first came out with the scientific method in the Enlightenment in the 1800s. And I'm basically what I every time I've dealt with this, and this is the problem. You know, people say science, and you know what they mean, but that word gets mixed up with a lot of other things. The scientific method is distinguished by two things. It's distinguished by experimentation, repeated experimentation, whatever, and also a controlling of variables. And experimentation is universal. I mean, people, it's not the only way to acquire knowledge, but people in all circumstances or all of history have acquired knowledge by experimenting. That's just like a normal way for people to interact. So a lot of the accomplishments that the you know, people call it like scientism, that the scientific establishment claims, a lot of that is because they're claiming everything people experiment for, where a lot of these innovations and these technological achievements, stuff like that, don't come from a laboratory. They come from like an engineer's workshop. They come from things where people are experimenting in the real world without trying to control variables in this scientific way. But the controlling
Yeah,
of variables,
I built my boat on a computer before I ever formed any plastic.
sure, but that's not a
No, this is evidence of what
at
you're
that
talking
point.
about, the experiment. So the experiment
Oh,
was
okay.
done on
So
the
you're
computer.
agreeing with me. There you
Yeah,
go. Yeah, I
yes,
mean, I would
yeah,
even
exactly.
call that more like, yeah. I mean, that there's other. Anyway,
No, I'm
that's
not talking about the manufacturing. Obviously, to program the CNC
there's like
machines, I obviously don't.
visualization going
No,
on there. There's
I'm
some other
talking.
interesting
Right,
stuff.
right. So I visualized the boat. I had it in my mind. I drew things out with a pencil and paper, old school at first. You know, I did measurements. I looked at other watercraft and things. So I did all this experimentation, this practical application of my hypothesis in different scenarios, and then I went ahead and tested tested the hydrodynamics on a computer program and did all that before I ever formed any plastic. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Before I actually came up with
yeah,
the design. So it's exactly what you're talking about, and that's
yeah.
you're right. There's a huge part of that. The thing that
Yeah,
I'm not
and a lot
understanding.
of people go through that process. They have the
Yeah,
hypothesis and all that. So they call
right,
this science. Well,
right,
it's not exactly what. See, the problem is like if you do that, and we're taught in school how to do that, and it's a decent approach. I mean, it's not that innovative to be like, well, I have this. Yes, I'm going to test it. Um, what distinguishes like the scientific establishment is that they have controlled environments. And that's the thing is like us ordinary people that are just out in the world, when we do things and we say we're doing science or something like that, a lot of times we're only doing one part of that. We can't really recreate what's being done if you are actually like hired. And I know people that work in that field, and I've dealt with them and stuff like that. And I kind of have to fight off contempt for them because they don't live in the real world. Um, but it's this controlled environment that really distinguishes it, and that controlled environment where you eliminate some variables, that is takes enormous expense because it's very unnatural and sterile, and so that the expense that goes into that and the funding and all that kind of stuff is where you start to then get, and this was true back in the day, even with Newton and Franklin and all these people. Well, these are people that had to make money first, basically, before they could really do, and they would do what we do out in the world. But that, this ideal of a controlled variable where you're only testing one variable at a time is kind of a fantasy. But the pursuit of that leads to an establishment that ends up being really dependent on funding, basically, and is run by people who have no idea how to make money in the real world. So they don't even necessarily understand that they are controlled. you know Now, and there's that, and then there's also the fact that the organs that publish and market and promote science are not the same ones um, who then actually conduct science. So like these nerds in a laboratory, when they write up a paper, nobody has any idea what they're talking about except other nerds in the laboratory. So then you have all these steps that between them and us, where all this stuff is interpreted and then given to us. Like in the scientific world, there is huge debate about the Big Bang Theory, for instance, and maybe you know about that. And there's a lot of things. There's tons and tons of debate about every single fossil, and basically there's a huge swath of, and this is even necessarily the same thing as science. It's just got that same kind of academic structure where there's no like profit incentive prima facie for going and digging up old bones. Just most people aren't willing to pay for that unless they have, and it takes a lot of effort to go do that, unless you have a special interest in it. And some people have a special interest in it. And so but in that world of evolutionary research, and I know people in that world, there's a huge push for eliminating a lot of the different classifications of fossils, because basically the argument is anytime someone digs up a bone or a fossil, they want to make a name for themselves, so they say it's a species, and then they name it after themselves. And that's especially true when they're getting fossils for human evolution. They do that a lot. And so there's basically cases of these people are not all creationists, where they want to eliminate a lot of these categories and things. Now, I can't remember how I got on to talking about that, but I was talking about.
Well, I was just trying to get a feel for where, because I asked you specifically. I'm just trying to get a feel for your worldview, so that I kind of have an understanding of how you approach the world. Because this is the first time we've ever had a chance to interact. So I really don't know. Obviously, don't know you that well. So I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to. Go ahead.
Another example that will help you understand, because I want to just show you that reasonable people believe what I believe. I want to show you I'm a reasonable man. I'm not just ignoring open hypocrisy or contradictions or anything like that. I've actually resolved all the ones that I can resolve. And the ones
are you talking about within the Bible?
No, just
contradictions in general.
My whole knowledge. Anytime I meet something that confuses me, I try to resolve it. And some of them I can't resolve, and I'm perfectly willing to admit that because I just don't have the expertise. And I try to deal with that as best I can. Um, but they're probably pretty embarrassing things all in all. But what I was going to say, another great example of this is history, because I do have a good understanding of history. My dad was a historian. His father was a diplomat and a translator for the army, and so history is just kind of passed down to me. The love of it. And one of the things that happened in history in the 1800s is there was this thing called, I can't remember the term for it, but basically what they said was, and you can read about this in Belloc, they said, miracles are not possible. So therefore, any piece of historical document that has a miracle recorded in it has to be considered not accurate. And so then historians started not considering those documents when they made their historical writings. Because most of what we read is not the primary source, because nobody can. And then that happened 200 years ago. So what is presented to us when we are pointed to primary sources usually are not those ones that were eliminated, because they have a recording of, for instance, St. Martin raising a man from the dead or something like that. And so that's why I approach the world philosophically and historically, because I understand that the philosophy that people embraced 200 years ago or 300, 400, 500, the assumptions in that philosophy then determines, by and large, the information that I have access to nowadays. Because if it didn't prove that philosophy, it wasn't preserved. So that's another good example, and that kind of gives you an idea of why, like evolutionary biology and stuff like that, it's easy for me to oppose it, because most of the people involved in it have the wrong philosophy.
Are you aware that two things? First of all, when it comes to the economic structure, okay, you must be aware that there is a very, very small percentage of people, human beings on the entire globe, that are actually controlling the entire economic narrative for everybody else, right? This is not.
That's the problem.
Yeah. Okay. So
I actually think they're dead too. Just so you know, I think that the ones.
Sure. So the ones that started it all, sure. It's been a few generations later, but we're both on the same page with that.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. It's not important.
So we're both on the same page with the significant minority, and I'm talking about yeah. Okay, so we definitely have common ground there. Where we're disconnecting is this is about economic control, and the best way historically, if you're a historian, and I take you for your word at that, if you're actually a historian, you must know two things: that the best way throughout recorded history to get a large group of people to do something is to use religion as the common motivator. I mean, that's just a historical fact. You must also know that 93% of the world is religious. I mean, just the Abrahamic faiths alone account for half the global population, right? So which is more evidence that the best way to get people to do what the government wants them to do, and the people in charge, and ultimately the people in charge of them, would be to use religion, not to fight against religion. I mean, just by the numbers.
Yeah, that's the problem in the Catholic Church right now. Yeah.
Okay, so if that's the case, then why? And there's this big economic push to just push the most profitable science. The most profitable science would be science that verifies religious claims. If what you're saying is true, if it actually maps out and you're going to be consistent with it.
No, that's not true, because the minority of people that control things, if you understand history, for the most part, departed from religion a long time ago. And
yeah, but they have departed, but the masses of people they're controlling haven't departed, and they don't want them to depart. Because if they did want them to depart, then we would be departed, because they are in control. Because we all got to eat, we all got to have a roof over our head, and we all got to have food on the table. So we would literally be divided. There would be no religion if that's what the people in charge really wanted.
Sure. I well, they definitely they don't want people to be irreligious. What they want is they want people to be constantly in conflict with their neighbor over anything. That's what they want.
Well, I
And
definitely agree with that. Politics is a perfect example of that here in America, where you and I both live. It's so divisive. They want they constantly putting out propaganda to get white people to hate black people and gay people to hate straight people and everything else in between. It's just all political propaganda. I don't doubt that whatsoever. But
yeah. Well,
what's
the
not
big one
happening?
is they get fathers to hate their sons. They get baby
Sure,
boomers to think that the younger generation is lazy, and then they get the younger generation to think that baby boomers are irredeemable or heartless, maybe. It's kind of interesting. But yeah, I mean, so to answer your question though, so then the reason why then they would incentivize this with the scientific establishment is because they didn't need to provide evidence to all the religious beliefs. It was already there. So they needed to build up a new opposition in order to create more. And also, a lot of it, I think, if you look into like social Darwinism and things like that, a lot of that was to assuage their own guilty consciences as they abused and killed people. You know, because it's just easier to do that without the some of the religious underpinning to your. You just can't, like, if you think that there's more than this life and that God will judge you on your actions, then you're just gonna hesitate more to do things, even if they're furthering your survival, improving your quality of life. You know, there's a few more factors that now have to come into play. And the thing is, once people started doing usury, especially, but I mean, it's kind of like England. So England conquered the world, right? And before America did, we just inherited their empire in a lot of ways. England departed from the Catholic Church in schism and then fell into heresy. Well, one of the things that became very popular amongst English thinkers was trying to say that they were the chosen people descended from the lost tribes of Israel. Why? Well, because they had to explain why England was the only nation that had the true religion. Which didn't make sense. So the only thing they could do is associate themselves with the Israelites, who were the only nation that had the true religion at one point. So
now, the other thing that I think is interesting is that it seems like, when I hear religious people talk about what I'm calling a conspiracy theory, frankly, about science taking over God and trying to disprove God and trying to counter religion and stuff like that, that it's completely
it just
motivated.
depends on what part of science. Like, if you read
that's the
Darwin,
whole thing. That's the thing
and
that
you
I'm
read
talking about.
Darwin's people, they talk
But that's
about
what I was
the
going to.
conflict.
Yeah, but that's what I was going to say.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to say. Is that if you actually know? So I'm an engineer, right? So I actually know, because it's the field that I'm in, is a type of science, that all of science is what we call an interconnected discipline. So it would actually be impossible for evolutionary biologists to come up with a pseudoscience crackpot theory and actually have that make any traction, because every single field of science is either directly or indirectly connected. Every single field. It's like trying to say that you could disconnect your nervous system from your skeletal system, even though they don't touch, because the nerves go to the muscles, right? But that's not possible. Your skeletal system moves, your arms move because the muscles that are attached to the bones move, and the nerves that fire electrical signals into the muscles cause those muscles to contract. It's all interconnected. And the same thing is for science. You cannot remove or isolate any field of science and then say that field is going to start putting out pseudoscience and get away with it, because everything is dependent on everything else. So our bridges, the house you live in, the electrical panel that's running through your wall, all of this stuff, the water that you drink, I mean, literally everything is connected. The hospital that you take your kids to, all of this stuff is ultimately interconnected in one way or another. Geology is connected to all that, even though you're not out there digging up fossils. It's all connected. So you can't just have one field of science. It's got to be every field of science, or it's got to be no field of science.
Yeah. I think I have to wrap this up soon. Sorry, it's getting late. Yes, I agree with you. In fact, it's kind of interesting because it connects to what I was saying about different definitions of science. So, like we had the natural sciences, which is kind of what you're talking about at this point, which is completely different from the scientific method. And, well, what you would expect, this is true for the church too, by the way, if the church is not all in unity in its beliefs and in its actions, then it will be sick or injured or something like that. And it's visibly apparent. And everyone knows that's true about the Catholic Church right now. And so yeah, same thing in science. And with evolutionary biology, it helps that the actual measurement and recording and testing and all that kind of thing is what you're talking about. And that can be perfectly accurate. It's the extra interpretations that are outside of this field that they really can't comment on that and a lot of those are done by people that aren't even in that field, that are just like a lot of times just fulfilling like a marketing purpose or something like that, or just doing something that has nothing to do with science, and they think they know what they're talking about. But there are definitely disastrous effects because of the bad philosophy in evolutionary biology, like and I can list those for you. And a lot of the problems we're having right now with people's lives in disease and stuff like that, cancer and all that kind of stuff, is because they understand the human body is having evolved over time and having all these flaws and all these like for instance, the appendix being removed. That's a big one, because when your appendix is removed, it affects you significantly. Wisdom teeth is another one. Dentists and whatnot talk about the change in the diet has more to do with that. Trying to think of some other. If you look into brain death, that's kind of comes from the materialist idea that a human being is just material, which is an assumption in evolutionary philosophy. And basically what they do is they set an arbitrary measurement for when you're dead, and I can point you to a guy, Dr. Paul, can't remember his last name now, it's escaping me, but he's a pediatrician, and he spent his life, and now he's talking about that. But basically what happens is they declare your brain dead, and then they harvest your organs. Some organs, like a heart, stuff like that, is not useful if taken from an actual dead person. And so some people they harvest these things from are still feeling it, and are still, people go to that level of brain activity and then come back and are alive and say, well, I've heard what you said, and I felt these things being done to me. And this doctor has traveled around saving people from being dissected in that way for profit.
Well, I agree, and I grant you that there have been many mistakes, many, an innumerable amount of mistakes that were made by scientists of every field. The thing about science and the beauty of science is that it's essentially what we would call self-correcting, and that is that it's always open to new interpretation. Unlike religious dogma, which is set in stone, and anytime somebody tries to reinterpret things, they end up having to basically get ostracized from their own religion, and they have to either start their own religion or move on to something else, secularism or whatever else it is. There's no room for, hey, you know what, we made a mistake here, or you know what, we might be wrong here. It's very strict and ardent and dogmatic. Science is not. As much as people want to say that it is, it really is. That's the whole point of science, is that it actually allows itself. Anybody can do an experiment. Anybody can do an experiment, and anybody could actually publish depending on the validity of their experiment. If you've got the evidence, and I'm living proof of that. The boats have been being built for millennia, thousands of years. And who am I to come along and invent a new type of a boat? It's because these opportunities are open to anybody. And I'm living proof of that, but I know we're getting to the end of our conversation. I very much enjoyed getting to learn about the Catholic Church and to speak with you. As I said before, you seem like a really solid guy. I disagree, obviously, with some things that you said, but at the end of the day, I still think the same thing I thought about you when I came in here before we talked. I think you're a solid dude. You seem like a good family man. You've got a good heart. I can clearly see that. So, like I said, just because we don't see eye to eye on things doesn't mean that I haven't really enjoyed this conversation.
Well,
I think we should.
I'm really excited that we do see eye to eye. That there is a problem that all of us suffer under. It doesn't even matter that you don't believe in the flood. I could care less. I'm just here to entertain you. But just like economically, there's so much money in the world. There's so much wealth, which is different than money, and we live like paycheck to paycheck, and it's because of usury. And I'm glad we agree on that. So,
oh, absolutely. Yeah. If you ever want to have me back on to talk about problems from a scientific standpoint or an engineering standpoint with the flood narrative, I'm happy to do that. I would encourage you now, given I don't know with your position about science, I don't know if you'll take it seriously or not, but the heat problem is a major problem for your flood narrative. The Answers in Genesis has put millions of dollars into trying to prove the global flood, millions of dollars. And they admit fully they can't get around the heat problem. The other problem with the hydroplate theory, there's a number of problems with the hydroplate theory. You can go to any specialty that you want to, but the biggest problem is going to be Newton's third law of motion. I would look into that. If you're going to blast enough material off the planet to make the asteroid belt, then you're going to decimate the planet, because for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. I'd look into that. And then as far as the seaworthiness of Noah's Ark, that would take me obviously much longer to flesh out with you. But basically the nuts and bolts of it is, just because you could get a boat, a piece of wood or a wooden craft that's got a 350 cubits by 50 cubits length to beam ratio that would actually float on flat water, doesn't mean that thing is seaworthy. As soon as you start loading that down, you're increasing the downward pressure. And as soon as the downward pressure exceeds the upward pressure, then you're sunk, you're capsized. And you're talking about waves that would be miles high. You're talking about the heat pressure, the heat problem. The Ark would have been incinerated just because of the heat problem alone. But when you start crashing waves that are miles high on top of any boat, a modern battleship wouldn't have survived that flood, according to the narrative. So there's definitely some real science and engineering behind these things. I would definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I ask you ever heard of the miracle of Fatima?
I've heard of Fatima. Are you talking about Fatima or however you said it, Fatima?
Yeah.
I don't know about the miracle of. Okay, go ahead and tell me. Steel man it for me.
Everyone, and I mean, it's not a big deal because I know you just say, well, God of the gaps or whatever. But the Fatima is a thing that every Catholic will know about if you talk to them about it. Everyone talks about it. It's one of the most recent apparitions of Our Lady. It's accepted by the church. And it's not actually, it was one of the most publicly witnessed and recorded things that's happened. It happened in I can't remember the date now, but it's like somewhere in the 1910s, I think. But the most recorded one was Our Lady of Good Success was the statue was animated in Ecuador. But this one was very big and everyone knows about it. And the miracle that happened was the sun was dancing in the sky, and it had been raining, and everyone was soaking wet. And then the sun, after this thing it was doing, came down towards them all, and or whatever, maybe the sun or a sun, whatever, and just kind of enveloped them in brightness. And then that passed away, and they were all perfectly dry. And from what I hear when I talk to scientists and whatnot, the heat required to do that would have incinerated them, to just get rid of all that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it would have incinerated.
So that's an interesting thing to look into, because that's written in newspapers.
There's not multiple suns. There's not multiple suns in our solar system, so it'd have to be the sun, because otherwise there's no other sun. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what was happening visually, but they always say the sun, so there was no other sun in the sky that these people could see. Right. But there was like newspaper pictures and stuff. It's very easy to look into. I'm sure there's people. I
will. I've never heard of it. I've heard of Fatima, and I don't know why I know that name, because I've not heard that story.
It's a Muslim thing. People talk about that too. Oh. This happened in Portugal. Fatima was a daughter of Muhammad, That's what the city's name
That's where I heard. Thank you. I
Yeah.
knew I'd heard that name before. Okay, so what's yours going to be called? Or is this the same story?
Look up Our Lady of Fatima
Our
or
Lady.
the
Okay, I will. I will
the
definitely look at. Yeah.
apparitions of
Hey,
Fatima.
I know you're a busy guy, but I would highly encourage you to post. You made a lot of frankly very very vague references to sources and this and that, and I would encourage you to post those in your chat because, like I said before, I will sincerely engage with you on that. I'll look at those, and if I find something that I was
Okay.
in error of or that is even I find even remotely convincing, I will definitely touch base with you and let you know,
Cool.
what I think about all that. If you're interested in doing that, I would encourage you to.
I'm interested in it. If you could remind me to do it, I would consider it an act of mercy.
Of course, no worries, brother. And then the other thing I'll just finish with this by one thanking you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you, brother. And I will, once we get a hard date set for that debate that I'm going to have, I will definitely reach out to you and let you know. So if you have time, you can either check it, you can watch it live, or you can follow up with it. But my plan is, and I don't know, I got to talk to the host, but my hope is that what we're going to do is we're going to launch this debate and keep things moving fairly quickly. So like 15-minute openings, 10-minute closing, kind of 30-minute cross section, just really quick, which is tough to do into something really complex when you're too pressed for time. But I do want to move it fairly quickly so that we can engage with the audience. And what I'm hoping is he will open up the panel so that anybody can then jump in instead of just sending questions through the chat, that people can actually get into the live stream and we can all engage together. So that's kind of the format that I'm shooting for. So if you're able to attend live, I'd love to have you jump in and maybe voice your opinion about things or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I mean that sounds interesting. Yeah, because I'm just an ordinary dad. I'm a little bit more educated than I should be, and so I'm definitely a better audience member than somebody who can just rattle off sources and that kind of thing. That's where I shine. I'm just the Catholic people have access to. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I can dig it, brother.
You can persuade me. That works out better. Anyways. Well, God bless you. Thank you for your time, especially since you did this whole thing while paddling a boat. That's impressive.
Oh yeah. I'm a multitasker. No, the truth is I'm actually I don't really put my picture up these days right now anyway because I'm recovering from a major surgery. And so I actually held it together pretty good through our conversation. I was able to focus and stuff, but I'm having major pain right now. I really need to take some kind of medication. I just hate taking that stuff. But the doctors, I've been going through this for almost 2 years now, and I finally had my final surgery recently, and they said that it's going to be 2 months to a year for recovery, and I'm about 3 weeks out of surgery. So I've got a long road ahead of me. So I just don't picture up because I'm just not feeling it right now, but maybe one of these days. But that is me riding my boat. If you're ever interested or your audience member of checking it out, it's ITSU Wave Master, the letters ITSU, and then the word wave and the word master. I've long since sold my patents and my business and everything, but there's an article from Kayak, I think Angler Magazine, that's still up on the internet and stuff, and you could always look at my channel and see I've got a very short 1-minute video of me riding through some whitewater rapids, and I'm a legit guy. I've done if I say I've done something, I've done it. My credentials are real.
Nice. I'm sorry about this surgery. That sounds difficult. I'll pray about that as quick as I can.
Well, I do appreciate that. Yeah, I'm not one of those. It always blows me away. And I understand that people are, at the end of the day, people are people. And on both sides of the aisle, people can be jerks. But some things that I just cannot wrap my head around is why an agnostic or an atheist would get upset when a Christian or somebody says, I'll pray for you. I mean, literally, you've been on enough atheist chats. You've probably seen that they actually have rules against praying. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like that's so wild to me. If somebody says I'll pray for you, I'll be like, thanks, brother. I don't know. Now granted I'm an agnostic, so maybe it'll work. Who knows? But I find it to be that to me that's a nice thing that you're offering to do for me, at least
That's
in your
difficult.
worldview. It's certainly not an insult of any kind. I just don't. People are in such a hurry to be offended these days.
Yeah, I got kicked out of a group for saying "God bless you" too aggressively.
That's hilarious. That's just wild. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I actually have gotten kicked out of an atheist group one time for telling them that they got the definition of atheism and agnosticism wrong, and they told me to stop preaching. yeah, they told me to stop preaching. And I said, what are you talking about? I didn't even mention, like, I'm not, you know what I mean? And they're like, you're making all these wild claims. I says, well, no, I just read it out of the dictionary, but I've also written a paper on this back when I was in college. I don't tell a lot of people this because I don't want them to think I'm trying to put more weight on my knowledge or whatever, but I actually did study theology in college, and I actually attended seminary for a short while. So I've
Oh,
been,
wow.
I used to work as
Nice.
I used to work as a youth pastor, and I've worked with the church many years. I've been involved in this, but I don't have any
Must not have
degrees
been
in
Catholic.
theology.
Must have been something
No, it
else.
certainly wasn't. No, it certainly wasn't. No, it was Protestant. And
Okay.
non-denominational. So yeah, but I've been around the circles. I know my way cover to cover through the Bible. I mean, for a layperson,
Nice.
I'm very knowledgeable about these things as far as that goes. Above
Well,
average, I
that's
would say
good.
at least. Yeah.
Yeah, I think talking about getting kicked out of groups there's only that was a very particular atheist group. It was the atheist community, which is associated with the one in Austin, um, under that one heavy set guy. He's kind of
Aaron
rough.
Ra.
No, I'm forgetting, but he's really mean when he debates, and I don't particularly like him. But he's got like the atheist experience or something like that.
Oh, you're talking about Matt Dillahunty?
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Oh, I can't stand. No, I can't handle that guy. Because as you probably figured out, I'm about respect first and foremost, and civility. I mean, I think you and I have had a very polite discussion, even though we've disagreed on a lot of things. And that's my
Oh, that's
number
great.
one. And yeah, and I get the same vibe from you, and I just cannot handle people that behave like him. He is such a bad look for secularism and atheism, and he doesn't care. He probably knows it and doesn't care because he's so self-inflated, and he's got his audience, and I'm sure he's making a living doing whatever. But to anybody who's just an outside observer is going to watch that guy lose his. You just lose his whatever, his composure. I'm trying to be respectful on your channel and not swear, which is hard for me to do, by the
Yeah.
way, because it's kind of
Oh,
natural
that's
for me
fine.
the way I talk. He absolutely loses his composure on his own channel, crashes out. That's a term I'll use for it. He's crashing out on his own channel. And the thing is, he's probably in most cases, at least certainly in some cases, he's probably right. And he's making good arguments. But because he's so emotionally unhinged, people I mean, I don't understand how anybody could stand watching that guy.
Yeah, it's interesting because I knew he was associated with that group, and I kind of felt like he's interested in me. I think he has a very like martial attitude, and I think if you thought religion was the thing that was like oppressing everybody in the world, I could kind of understand that approach. Because I meet plenty of religious people that think liberalism is the thing that oppresses the world, and so they have a very like military, like this is a war, you know. And so I kind of like try to respect it. But yeah, I'm definitely like afraid to get near him. And I will say on that note that besides that atheist group, the only group that was worse than that, and I think they're just a little emotionally immature, to be honest with you. That's what all the atheists told me, who were like, "I'm sorry that happened to you." Like it's kind of like high school in there. But the group that was worse than them was Sedevacantists, which I love Sedevacantists. Some of my best friends are Sedevacantists. Very specific group that I don't need to explain right now. But like I got into a Sedevacantist group because they call themselves traditional Catholics, and which is fine. But I'm a traditional Catholic, and it's just like I got in there, and they were like immediately inquisitioning me on theology, and like one little thing that seemed wrong to them, and I was like, boo, just like I might as well be in hell currently. There's no talking to me ever again. It was crazy. I've never. So they were worse than the atheists. And I don't think
That's
they had
wild.
that emotional immaturity. So that's my own group of Catholics, which I find interesting. I've thought about it a long time since that happened. I have an explanation for it. It makes sense to me. But I got to get going. And
Yeah, for
you
sure.
are in
For sure.
pain, so you should rest. God bless
Yeah,
you.
I will. I'm going to log out and let you do your outro. Okay. Thanks for having me, brother.
All right. See you later. I don't have an outro. I'm just gonna say goodbye. God bless. As soon as I figure out the goodbye button, that's not the goodbye button. Oh, there's a lot of buttons popping up. Okay.